Charles Fraser. The Presumed Dead. The Adventures of the Elderly Sherlock Holmes. Episode 5. Based on the characters of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. A Go audio production. "Mr. Holmes! Mr. Holmes, do wait!" Holmes did not react at first. He ambled leisurely along Baker Street, his walking stick supporting him in his right hand, enjoying the warm sunbeams that shone directly on his face. Gradually he came to a halt, listening as he looked first in one direction and then the other, when Alice called out to him again, "Mr. Holmes, please wait." Only then did he notice her. Holmes raised his right hand in greeting, cane and all. My dear, you're completely out of breath." Panting, Alice stopped just in front of Holmes and fanned herself with a white envelope that she held in her hand. Holmes impatiently tapped his cane rhythmically on the ground. "One would think your 3 children would have given you better stamina. This, however, does not appear to be the case. I would recommend you visit a doctor at your earliest convenience. In my observation, your shortness of breath seems to have physical causes rather than mere lack of fitness, as is so often the case." Alice dismissed this with a wave of her hand. "Better focus on this instead." She held the envelope under Holmes's nose. "This dispatch has just arrived for you." Holmes took the envelope from Alice's hand and began reading with a furrowed brow before breaking into roaring laughter. Alice eyed him suspiciously. "Well, do tell me, what does it say?" Holmes pulled a handkerchief from his coat, briefly wiped his eyes, and discreetly blew his nose before responding in a stern tone with a raised index finger. "If this is meant to be a thinly veiled attempt to suggest that I should move to a retirement home, then I must tell you quite plainly, no." Holmes folded the note and was about to pocket it when Alice protested. "How could you even think that? And anyway, what does it say on that blasted thing?" Now, commented Holmes. "That's hardly the sort of language befitting a lady." With that, still smirking, he handed her the sheet of paper. Alice unfolded it again and began to read. "Dear Mr. Holmes, at the retirement home in Chiswick, incredible incidents have been piling up over the past few weeks. Staff and residents have long since been overcome with fear and anxiety. I expressly request your esteemed assistance. Signed, a fellow traveller." Alice furrowed her brow quizzically. "A companion? Have you any idea who might have written this?" Holmes pursed his lips. "If it wasn't you, and it wasn't some pathetic little attempt to get me out of my flat, then my answer is no, I don't know." Holmes offered Alice his arm. "Come, my dear, do me the honour of taking a little walk with me." Alice didn't hesitate and took Holmes's arm. "Will you take on the case?" "No, certainly not. Besides, I've already told you, you won't get rid of me that easily." Now Alice smiled too and gave Holmes a friendly pinch in his side. "You surely don't still believe we want to get rid of you? Who else would babysit my 3 children? Now that we've got you back on your feet, rescued you from your miserable existence, and made you somewhat useful again, we're certainly not going to show you the door. Admittedly, at some point your flat would be practical for my children. In about 10 years perhaps, when Patrick is old enough. But I think we can safely let time sort out that particular issue." Alice winked at Holmes and affectionately patted his hand. In feigned indignation, Holmes stopped. "My dear Alice, you're becoming more and more of a weapon. I greatly appreciate your sarcasm." Contentedly and in high spirits, the two of them walked back home. The days passed, and Holmes no longer gave any thought to the peculiar telegram and the mysterious signature. 3 weeks later, early one morning, Alice suddenly appeared at Holmes's door, knocking vigorously whilst holding a copy of the day's newspaper in her hand. "Have you read this yet?" she asked excitedly. Holmes yawned furtively whilst shaking his head. Alice gave Holmes a cursory glance. "I'm not disturbing you, am I? Have I just woken you up?" "Not woken up exactly, but one could hardly describe my state as fully awake either." Holmes took his place in his armchair and gestured for Alice to sit down as well. "What is it that I'm supposed to have read?" Alice leafed through the newspaper until she found the passage again and began to read. Mysterious death in retirement home. In the early hours of yesterday morning, a resident of the retirement home in Chiswick was found lifeless. According to initial reports and examinations, the male deceased did not die of natural causes, but was murdered. Furthermore, other residents of the retirement home reported mysterious incidents. Scotland Yard is investigating. Alice closed the newspaper. What do you make of that? Holmes lit his pipe and took a pleasurable draw before answering. Old people die. Besides, that's precisely why they're taken to these retirement homes. So, now an elderly person has died. How, why, and wherefore is essentially irrelevant. End of story. Alice shook her head as if she suddenly couldn't understand Sherlock Holmes anymore. Why are you so resistant to this case? What's the reason? Because you're old yourself? Because you don't want to be confronted with it? No, I don't believe that. There's something else. Alice, stop this at once! Holmes interrupted her harshly. I am the detective in this house. Go back to your children. Holmes stood up abruptly and indicated that the conversation was over. The children are at school, Alice retorted, raising her eyebrows defiantly. And another thing, stop smoking before breakfast. Otherwise, you'll end up in a retirement home sooner than you'd like. Then she rose and turned on her heel. In the evening, as expected, Holmes was invited to dinner by Alice and Eddy. The Miller children were already in bed, and dessert, consisting of apple pie, had been finished. Holmes had by now reached his pipe and a brandy when he leaned back contentedly and fixed Alice with his penetrating gaze. "Why are you staring at me like that?" she asked irritably. Holmes smiled smugly and replied, "I've just been wondering all this time who will be paying us a visit shortly. Inspector Lestrade or Inspector Wolfford?" Eddy Miller looked shamefully at the floor, while Alice blushed slightly. Right on cue, there was a knock at the door. Who could that possibly be at such a late hour? Alice clapped her hands in feigned surprise and hurried to the door. A brief moment later, Inspector Lestrade and Inspector Wolfford were standing in the Millers' living room. "Both of them!" exclaimed Holmes. "Good evening, gentlemen. Your journey was in vain. I'm retired." "I'm retired too, and yet here I am," Inspector Lestrade retorted, and took a seat right next to Holmes without being asked. "Now hold on a moment," Inspector Wolfford interjected. Holmes didn't let him continue speaking. "You're the lead investigator on that case in Chiswick, aren't you?" "How did you come to that conclusion?" asked Inspector Wolfford, baffled. "Not that you're wrong, but how do you know that?" "That is logically revealed to me by your presence." Holmes drew on his pipe irritably and crossed his legs stubbornly. "First this chance dinner, even though dear Alice and I had a disagreement this morning, and she was quite cross with me. Then both of you showing up. You all want to persuade me to take on this case. But Scotland Yard is already investigating, as was read to me earlier today." Holmes glanced sternly at Alice. "And I place the utmost confidence in you, Inspector Wolfford. Good luck, and good night." Holmes already had his walking stick at the ready and was about to rise to leave when Inspector Lestrade gently held his knee and pressed him back into the armchair. "Please listen to us, old friend, for old time's sake." Grinding his teeth, Holmes stared into space without saying another word. Inspector Wolfford cleared his throat and finally broke the silence. "My dear Mr. Holmes, as the lead investigator on the Chiswick case, I can tell you that we are not investigating. We visited the nursing home in question once. The matter is on record, and that's all. As much as I personally regret it, my hands are tied. Scotland Yard is drowning up to its neck in murder, manslaughter and robbery, so a death in a retirement home simply doesn't receive the priority and attention this case would deserve." Holmes still said nothing, continuing to stare straight ahead. Alice poured him another brandy and served a glass each to both inspectors. "Well now," Inspector Lestrade spoke up, or at least tried to. "Holmes, old chap, how should I put this? You have a personal interest in this case." Holmes took the brandy glass and drained it in one gulp. As Holmes remained silent, Inspector Lestrade tried again. "It's about... You know who it's about. He needs you now." Alice moved closer to Holmes and sat down on his other free side. She took his hand compassionately and squeezed it pleadingly. "Watson." Holmes flinched. "Dr. Watson is a resident of this nursing home. Please, Mr. Holmes, surely you cannot be indifferent to what happens to your long-standing best friend." Holmes's gloomy expression appeared frozen as he forced out the words with anguish. "Watson died to me a long time ago." Lestrade slammed his fist on the table, making the empty brandy glasses wobble precariously. "Holmes, enough of this nonsense. The fact is, Watson is alive and in danger at this retirement home. As his oldest and dearest friend, you owe it to him to get to the bottom of this." Angrily, Holmes leapt to his feet, his fingers clutching tightly around his cane, and it seemed almost as if the rage gave the old man the strength of someone in their mid-20s. "Watson's body may live, but his mind, his spirit is dead, gone, simply vanished forever. You can say what you like. And why don't you simply transfer him to another facility? Ever thought of that? There is no case for me." He swung his cane and left the room. The two inspectors, Eddy and Alice, remained behind. And while Holmes had long since been sitting in his armchair, bitter, smoking and staring blankly ahead, the remaining four sat together for half the night, contemplating what should be done. Thick fog. Holmes couldn't make out anything. He didn't know where he was situated. It grew lighter. The fog gradually dispersed. Sherlock Holmes was holding 2 test tubes when suddenly the door swung open and a good acquaintance entered with another man. Wait, this unfamiliar man was Watson. The young Dr. Watson. It was nearly a lifetime ago when they first met. Watson had returned from the war and was looking for new lodgings. Without hesitation, Watson moved in with Holmes on Baker Street. A fateful encounter. Then it went dark again. After a while, Holmes recognised young Mary. She had once been a client of his. Watson had fallen hopelessly in love with her. The two of them married. Watson moved out of Baker Street and opened his medical practice. Once again, thick fog obscured his vision. But suddenly, yes, he could make out a dog. The hound of the Baskervilles with its phosphorescent eyes. One of their most spectacular cases. There was the moor as well, and, of course, Watson. It turned black again. In his dream, Holmes opened his eyes and realised he was lying in a hospital bed. In the bed next to him lay Watson with a gunshot wound to his shoulder. Holmes began to sweat. What bloody good luck they'd had so often, surviving their many cases mostly, though not always, unscathed. Then Holmes closed his eyes again. As the darkness lifted again, he saw Watson standing at Mary's grave. He was a broken man. But then Caroline entered Watson's life and he blossomed again, his joy for life returning. But now Watson stood once more before a grave, the grave of his second great love, Caroline. And this time Watson wasn't merely broken, no, he was utterly destroyed. Drenched in sweat and trembling, Holmes awoke in his armchair. His pulse was racing. Fumbling, he reached for his walking stick but couldn't find it at first. He rose unsteadily and limped to the window. He flung it open. Cold air streamed through the smoke-filled, stuffy room, and Holmes took a deep breath. Gradually, he felt his heartbeat slowly returning to normal. What a dream that had been! Was he perhaps getting too old for opium? He forced himself to organise his thoughts. He remained standing by the open window for a long while, but now he knew exactly what had to be done. "Mr. Holmes, do open the door at once. We know perfectly well that you're in there." Alice hammered impatiently against Holmes's apartment door. Her 3 companions, Eddy, Inspector Lestrade and Inspector Wolfford, stood close beside her, also waiting to be let in. "It's open!" came a muffled voice from behind Holmes's door. The 4 looked at each other in disbelief. Alice pressed down on the doorknob and, accompanied by the 3 men, entered. But where was Holmes? "Mr. Holmes, where are you? Are you quite all right? Is something the matter?" The 4 of them looked around the sitting room questioningly. Holmes's armchair was empty, and there was no sign whatsoever of the master detective. "Back here, I'm lying in my bed," came the voice again, sounding frail. Alice hurried anxiously into Holmes's bedchamber. He was lying in bed. Good heavens, he seemed to have aged years overnight. Alice grabbed his hand. "Mr. Holmes, what's wrong with you? Did you fall? Can't you get up? I'll fetch a doctor right away." Alice was about to rush off, but Holmes held her back. "Wait, my dear, I'm quite all right." A gentle smile spread across his face. "But I believe you'll have to take me to the retirement home in Chiswick." He gave Alice a meaningful wink. "So this is all just for show?" said Inspector Lestrade, and it was less of a question than a statement. After all, he had known Sherlock Holmes the longest, and his masquerades were legendary. "The even older old codger suits you perfectly." Holmes sat up in his bed and gave a slight bow. "Credit where credit is due," said Inspector Wolfford. "So this means you're taking on the investigation after all? And it seems to me you have quite an ingenious plan. But if I may ask, what brought about this change of heart?" Holmes appeared thoughtful for a brief moment, then said, "Walk through fear. Peace lies beyond. I owe it to my old friend Watson, and to myself." He let his words sink in for a moment, then turned to Alice and Eddy. "You know what to do. I hope we can leave straight away." "You are very fortunate, Mr. and Mrs. Miller," said Amy Ascot, the manager of the Chiswick nursing home, who was sitting opposite the Millers as they registered their grandfather, Montgomery Miller, alias Sherlock Holmes. "Due to the mysterious incidents in recent weeks and the unfortunate death, we have several vacancies available. Usually we're completely full, but not to worry. Scotland Yard is working diligently to investigate the passing of the poor old man. Your grandfather will be in the very best hands with us." As she spoke, Mrs. Ascot shifted uncomfortably in her armchair with her large bottom. Her long, grey hair was pulled back severely into a bun at the nape of her neck. Her apricot-coloured suit unfortunately emphasised her pallid complexion. However, the matron didn't come across as unlikable at all. She had welcomed the Millers in an almost warm-hearted manner. She was visibly relieved and overjoyed about the new resident. She had been forced to accept many cancellations and departures in recent days. "Now, please tell me about your grandfather Montgomery. Why have you brought him to us today? Are there any particular illnesses, or does he need special care? What do we need to pay particular attention to?" Eddy looked questioningly at Alice. Thereupon, Alice, as always, took the lead, and Eddy secretly thanked God for his clever and eloquent wife. "Our Grandpa Monty isn't quite right in the head anymore, I'm afraid. He asks lots of questions, always wants to know everything in great detail, but sadly can't remember most of it. He forgets so many things." Alice's expression grew sad. She pulled a handkerchief from her skirt pocket and wiped an invisible tear from the corner of her eye. "What's more, he had a bad fall a few weeks ago. Since then, he's been physically quite limited and struggles to get out of bed and onto his feet by himself." Amy Ascot diligently noted down the details about her new resident. "Right then, I believe we have everything we need." She stood up and gestured for the Millers to do the same. Then she beckoned a young care assistant over and instructed him to escort Mr. Montgomery Miller and his relatives to his new room. Holmes was pushed along the long corridor in the wheelchair by Alice. The young carer, who casually introduced himself as Tony, pointed to a room at the end of the corridor on the right-hand side. Tony opened the door, and Alice, followed by Eddy, pushed Holmes inside. Holmes had to resist the strong urge to leap from the wheelchair and leave this dwelling as fast and as far as he could, with flags flying. In the stuffy, gloomy little room, 6 beds were crammed tightly together, 3 on each side. The room had a small barred window. Was this a prison or a retirement home? Well, the bars on the window were probably necessary. Any elderly person who was still somewhat capable of jumping out and escaping from all this would likely do so without much hesitation. 5 of the beds were already occupied. From 4 of the beds, there was no reaction when the Millers and Holmes entered the room. Only one head raised itself a few centimetres, and its owner briefly lifted a hand in greeting. At least his empty bed was right at the back by the window, directly next to the bed that housed the lifting head and the greeting hand. "Well, Grandpa, here we are, your new home." Holmes gave her an indignant look. "Thank you, little Ally." "Alice, Grandad." "My name is Alice," said Alice in feigned indignation. The nurse, Tony, immediately wanted to help Holmes out of his wheelchair and into his bed, but Alice raised her hand in protest. "Thank you very much, but we'd prefer to do that ourselves." "As you wish. Take all the time you need. I'll come back a bit later to see if you need anything." Young Tony let go of the wheelchair and added, "Welcome to Chiswick." And with that, he left the three of them alone. When Tony had left, Holmes got up and lay down in his bed. "And are you absolutely certain you want to stay here?" Alice whispered in Holmes's ear. Holmes nodded. "Don't worry about me. Once this case is solved, I have the option to return home." Holmes let his shocked gaze wander around the room. "However, these poor people—" He didn't continue. Alice placed Holmes's small suitcase next to his bed. Then she lovingly squeezed his hand one last time in farewell. And with that, she and Eddy left Holmes to his fate. Holmes lay on his bed, staring at the crumbling ceiling. He listened to the sounds. From outside, screams occasionally penetrated through the door. About half an hour ago, an elderly woman had suddenly come into their room and began to weep miserably. 2 care workers had rushed in right after her and took her away. Now he could only hear the muffled breathing sounds of his fellow residents. Suddenly there was a knock at the door, and it swung open immediately. Young Tony entered, pushing a food trolley in front of him. He took a plate with a warming cover from it and placed it on Holmes's bedside table. "Do you need help with eating, or can you manage on your own?" Holmes did not react and continued staring at the ceiling. "Hello, Mr. Miller." Tony tried again. "Do you need help with your meal?" Only now did Holmes turn to Tony, as if he had only just noticed him. No, don't trouble yourself." Holmes laboriously manoeuvred himself into a sitting position, took the fork in one hand, and lifted the warming dome with the other. For several seconds, he studied the plate with a furrowed brow. "Forgive me, what was your name again? I beg your pardon, but what on earth is this dish supposed to be?" The young nurse glanced briefly at Holmes's plate. Then he said, "My name is Antonio Suarez, but you can call me Tony. To answer your second question, tonight's dinner is tasteless stew. The cook serves this at least 4 times a week. And another thing, be grateful that the stew is tasteless. I'd rather not know what ingredients are floating around in there. But look on the bright side. It fills you up, and no one has died from it yet. Speaking of dying, I heard that someone was recently murdered here in your nursing home. Did you know the man?" Holmes asked in a feigned, fragile voice. "Yes, of course I knew him," Tony replied with a regretful undertone. "Mr. Jordan was an extremely nice, likeable man, remarkably fit for his age. I simply can't understand how something like this could have happened." "Tony," echoed suddenly from the corridor, "what's taking you so long? Old Mrs. Binderman still needs to be fed. Come on, it's your turn. I'm certainly not going to let that old bat give me grief today." "How charming," Holmes remarked sarcastically. "A colleague of yours?" Tony rolled his eyes. "Yes, a colleague. You'll certainly get to meet Violet. A little tip, just go along with whatever she says and don't ask any questions. Then she'll be gone quickly enough." He winked at Holmes as he left the room swiftly. Holmes stared after Tony for a while until he heard a quiet clearing of the throat from the bed next to him. "Can I help you with anything, sir?" Holmes asked his bed neighbour, who had raised his hand in greeting when he arrived. There was still no reaction from the other 4 occupied beds. No, replied a fragile voice. "I just want to introduce myself. My name is Jonathan. It's nice to have you here. It makes me feel a bit calmer." "What do you mean by that, Jonathan?" Holmes asked, his interest piqued. "Oh, strange things are happening here, eerie, ghostly, and now that the spirits have killed Mr. Jordan too. Well, one feels rather more at ease when there's a second pair of eyes and ears keeping watch during the night." What spooky things have happened to you then? Holmes wanted to know. Jonathan cleared his throat several times before finding his words again. You can hear ghosts wailing here at night. Noises. Oh, so many eerie noises, the old man whimpered. There's clattering of dishes, objects disappear, scribbles on the walls. It's simply terrifying, especially when you can't just get up and run away. With these words, old Jonathan pulled his blanket up to his chin. Holmes winked at him hopefully. Together we shall get through the nights. That's what the doctor said too, until… But Jonathan couldn't continue. The door swung open noisily, and in came Violet, the nurse, carrying 2 bedpans. She approached Jonathan first. Come on, you old codger, you know the drill. Impatiently, she yanked Jonathan's blanket up, pulled down his pyjama bottoms, and pressed him with the bedpan. Jonathan struggled to lift his precious posterior, but couldn't manage it in time. Violet playfully pinched his bottom, making him jump up startled. There you go, you old codger, she guffawed loudly. She now approached Holmes. He opened his eyes in horror. That won't be necessary, madam. Oh, madam, she said, amused. We've got ourselves a right posh one here. Mercilessly, she yanked Holmes's blanket off. He clutched his trousers with both hands. I really must protest, Holmes pressed out through clenched lips. You can beg all you want, old man, but it won't do you any good. Lift up that wrinkled bottom, or you'll see what I'm capable of. I don't recall giving you permission to address me so informally. Violet burst out laughing. Then, with a swift and forceful tug, she yanked down Holmes's trousers. In response, Holmes grabbed his cane, which was positioned within reach beside his bed, with his right hand, and struck Violet on the shin. She cried out in shock and hopped around the room on one leg. Jonathan next door cheered. Holmes continued to swing his cane menacingly. Madam, if you come near me again, I cannot be held responsible for the consequences. But Violet rummaged in her nurse's uniform and pulled out a small syringe. Quick as lightning, she jabbed it into Holmes's thigh and flashed him a triumphant look. Good night, my very special new friend. Sleep tight and dream sweetly of me. That was the last thing Holmes heard before his eyes closed, and he fell into a restless sleep. It was dark. Were his eyes open or still closed? He wasn't sure. Was he awake or still sleeping? He could detect stale, stuffy air, wheezing and irregular breaths. He heard quiet whimpering. Was that a shadow? He thought so, at least. The shadow moved and crept out of his field of vision. Then the whimpering grew louder. Now he could even understand it. Holmes, it's me. Please help me. Sherlock Holmes lingered for a while on the surface of consciousness until he suddenly opened his eyes when a loud, fear-filled scream jolted him back to reality. Frantically, he looked around the room. All was quiet. Only his bed neighbour Jonathan seemed to be awake. Was that you? What happened? The latter asked him. Holmes rubbed his eyes. He noticed he was drenched in sweat. His pyjamas were clinging to his body. I feel as though I've been assaulted with a bedpan and then knocked out with sedatives, Holmes explained. That's exactly what happened to you, said Jonathan with a chalk-white face. I know, Holmes stated dryly. But that doesn't matter now. Just look around in here. Jonathan gestured around the room with a trembling hand. Sherlock Holmes stretched his limbs, gently patted his cheeks with his palms, and tried to clear his head and dispel the dark shadows of the previous night. The door was suddenly flung open and in burst Amy Ascot herself, the nursing home manager. Good heavens! She cried out in shock. What in the devil's name is going on here? She sought Jonathan's gaze, then directed her attention back to the floor before turning to Holmes. Mr. Miller, did you witness any of this? Holmes shook his head no. And you, Jonathan? But he too shook his head vigorously. Mrs. Ascot briefly surveyed the chaos before addressing both men again. This incident must be kept in absolute secrecy. I won't have any more negative headlines damaging our institution's reputation further. Is that clear? She asked, in a tone that brooked no argument. Then she added reassuringly, "Besides, nothing truly serious has happened. No one was hurt. This bit of mess. I'll send for someone to clean this up straight away." Sherlock Holmes stood up and surveyed the full extent of the night's intrusion. Countless items of clothing, mixed with hundreds of goose feathers, were scattered throughout the room. Among them were red splatters here and there. Blood splatters, Holmes suspected. Holmes turned to Jonathan, who now lay silently, staring anxiously at the ceiling. "Tell me, did you really not notice anything unusual last night?" Jonathan flinched. "No, did you? I slept like a log myself." Holmes would have liked to say the same about himself. All too vividly, he could still hear the whimpering and the words begging him for help. He could also remember the shadow all too well. He knew this hadn't all just happened in a dream. Shortly after, another nurse appeared. She was a young thing and had a remarkably calm and almost loving way of dealing with the elderly patients. She was only a temporary helper, as Jonathan reported. The nurse brought Holmes and Jonathan breakfast, which consisted of an indefinable mass of porridge. Afterwards, she helped both men with their morning ablutions, assisted them into their wheelchairs, and pushed them out of the room, along the corridor, and into the day room. While Holmes and Jonathan whiled away the time in the sparse room, Holmes assumed the young nurse would tend to the 4 other bedridden patients before dealing with the chaos in the room. The common room consisted of a round, worn-out small table and 3 matching, equally shabby, hard wooden chairs. In one corner stood a pitiful houseplant on the verge of dying, whilst in the other corner there was a narrow bookshelf containing exactly 7 books which, in Holmes's opinion, weren't even worth taking a closer look at their covers. Holmes sat bored in his wheelchair and gazed down at the street through the glass door, watching the hurrying, busy people passing by. "Damn you and your outrageous offer!" he suddenly heard Amy Ascot thunder from her office. Holmes became alert. Slowly, he wheeled his wheelchair out of the common room and along the corridor to Mrs Ascot's office. The door was left ajar. Holmes slowly rolled past it and positioned himself with his wheelchair just around the corner behind it. Amy Ascot had stood up and was leaning with both hands on her desk, whilst opposite her sat a well-dressed younger man with crossed legs. "But Mrs Ascot, do be reasonable. Your care home is visibly succumbing to age, and you simply cannot afford the maintenance, try as you might. We both know that. And after these headlines about ghosts and murder in your house, patients are staying away. Do accept it at last. Take my extremely generous offer, live happily and contentedly without worries, and I'll demolish this place and finally build my residential units." Holmes heard Amy Ascot snort angrily. "For 3 months you've been sitting in my office weekly, making one shabby offer after another. When will you finally understand that I have no intention of selling to you?" The well-dressed man stood up and faced Amy Ascot. "I don't think you've realised that you have no choice but to accept my offer." He then turned to leave, but at the door he looked back at Mrs Ascot once more. "Until next week, let's hope no more old folks die before my next visit, or perhaps the ghost will have thrown you out of the window by then." He left the office with a snicker. Holmes quickly moved out of the way and rolled back to the common room. What he had just overheard was very interesting indeed. That was nothing short of a pure threat. Holmes couldn't dwell on his thoughts for long. The young nurse appeared and took Jonathan and Holmes back to their room and subsequently to their beds. The room had been tidied, the floor cleaned, and all traces of blood removed. "Did you actually know the dead man well? Were you friends?" Jonathan sighed loudly. "Jack Jordan was a very pleasant man. He had only one son who lives on the continent. His wife had died long ago from some illness. That's why he was here. He had no one left to look after him. Meanwhile, he actually needed hardly any help at all. He was in good health, as far as one can say that at such an advanced age. What I also know is that he suffered terribly from his sleep disorders. During the day he was dog-tired, and at night he struggled to find peace. He often complained about lying awake half the night and being unable to sleep. I believe something was really troubling him. Was it grief over his deceased wife, his distant son? I don't know. Jonathan stared vacantly into space. Holmes did the same. "Alice, heaven has sent you!" Holmes greeted his friend and landlady with relief as she visited him in the afternoon as promised. Alice pulled a chair up to the bed, sat down next to Holmes and took his bony hand. "How are you, Grandad?" Holmes looked at Alice with amusement. "We can talk, my dear." Holmes gestured towards Jonathan. "This one's sleeping like a log and the other four aren't aware of anything." "What? Don't you like being called Grandpa?" Alice teased. "Well then, how are you, Mr. Holmes?" "Let's put it this way. Just promise me that you'll never shove me into this establishment." "That bad?" asked Alice worriedly. "Let's not talk about it. You need to do something for me." Alice nodded eagerly. "Of course, whatever you want. You need to find out whether the deceased, Jack Jordan, has already been buried or is still at the pathology department. If he is still there, which I assume to be the case since Scotland Yard hasn't closed the investigation yet, and Mr. Jordan has no relatives here who could have pushed for a funeral, you'll need to arrange an appointment at the pathology department for tomorrow afternoon, and take me there." Alice nodded busily, and Holmes continued. "We'll disguise it as an outing for fresh air. As far as I'm aware, there's no rule against briefly leaving the nursing home when accompanied." "You can rely on me, Mr. Holmes," Alice assured him. Holmes winked approvingly, then said, "And now tell me about the children. How are Patrick, Marie and Emma?" "The three of them miss you? We all miss you. I'm supposed to give you this." Alice pulled a sheet of paper from her pocket and handed it to Holmes. Holmes's lips curved into a smile. Little Emma had drawn him a picture. It showed a horse with 5 legs, a small girl sitting on it, and an old man with a walking stick holding the horse's reins. "So she still wants a pony," Holmes noted with a smirk. "Perhaps you should grant the little one this wish. As one can see from the drawing, she'll certainly never be a Van Gogh, let alone a mathematical genius. But as a jockey, she might well have a chance." Alice glared at Holmes angrily and snatched the picture from him. "You ungrateful old man! Little Emma put so much effort into this." Holmes burst out laughing. "I was only joking. I love the picture." Holmes took the picture back and looked at it again with a smile. "Give my very best regards to the 3 of them, especially little Emma." Thankfully, Tony the nurse was back in the evening. There was still no sign or sound of Violet. Tony served the tasteless stew again. While Jonathan ate dutifully, Holmes just listlessly poked around in his plate. Tony joined the 2 men at the bedside. "How are you both doing? I hope you weren't too frightened this morning. Mrs. Ascot told me what happened in your room last night." Jonathan nearly choked on his stew. "Being frightened is putting it mildly. I almost died of fear." Now! Tony tried to calm him. "Apparently not much happened. I assure you there's no need to be frightened. By the way, how is your grandfather? Do you know yet whether he'll be coming to this care home?" Tony suddenly appeared withdrawn and sad. "In the end, my mother will decide. No offence, but I can only hope that won't be the case." Tony stood up, pushed the chair back to its original position and said, "Right then, I must be off now. But I can share some pleasant news with you. Violet has the evening off. She won't be back on duty until tomorrow evening." "Well, if that isn't good news," Holmes remarked ironically and finally tried a spoonful of his stew. "Before you go, could you pour me another cup of your excellent and, above all, effective tea? I'm slowly starting to believe your tea is responsible for my sleeping so well lately." "Of course. I'll just finish my rounds quickly, then I'll bring you a cup. Mr. Miller, would you like some tea as well?" Tony asked Holmes. "I don't think so, thank you," he replied. When Tony had left the room and was heading to the next room with his food trolley, Holmes put his spoon aside and said, "Jonathan, what did you mean earlier about Tony's grandfather? Tony seems rather preoccupied with this matter." Jonathan swallowed his last mouthful of stew and pushed his plate away before answering Holmes. "Dear Tony loves his grandfather more than anything, as he once told me. He was like a father to him. His real father died when he was young, and his mother barely looked after him, if at all. Now his grandfather is seriously ill and can hardly be managed at home anymore. He's meant to be brought to this care home, which Tony, for reasons we can understand, desperately wants to prevent. His mother, however, can't and won't pay for a different home. Tony's grandfather must still need care in the meantime, Holmes observed. I assume Tony is the one taking care of him? Why doesn't he continue doing so? Tony has recently got engaged and plans to marry soon. However, his betrothed is from Belgium, and they will be moving there before the wedding. Muttered Holmes. I understand. The night was falling. Jonathan was already fast asleep, whilst Holmes lay in the darkness, lost in thought, staring at the ceiling once again. A quiet rustling pulled him from his contemplations. Where was that sound coming from? Holmes listened intently. There it was again, now accompanied by a soft whimper. Immediately, he felt transported back to his dream from the night before. Holmes, came a whisper. Could it be? Here he was only known as Montgomery Miller. Holmes! He heard it clearly and distinctly. Holmes groped in the darkness for his cane and awkwardly attempted to get out of bed. Then he felt around on the bedside table for the matches and immediately struck one with a hiss. He lit the candle, which was meant to serve as a nightlight in this shabby institution, and slowly stepped forward on bare soles, bit by bit, towards the opposite bed. Holmes, at last you're here. Sherlock Holmes was horrified. He stood there, holding the candle in one hand and his cane in the other, as if turned to stone. He felt hot, his heart pounding wildly in his chest, and his pulse beginning to race. Hesitantly, he opened his mouth slightly, as if forcing himself to finally speak aloud the word, the name that was more familiar to him than anything else, yet which had caused him such great sorrow in recent years, and had plunged him into such a deep emotional void. Watson! Escaped his lips in disbelief. Holmes summoned all his courage, took another step towards the bed, and shone the candle into the face of the person lying there. The light flickered wildly in his trembling hand. A familiar pair of eyes flashed at him. The hair was whiter and thinner, the cheeks more sunken, the skin more wrinkled and sickly yellow, but it was truly him. At least physically. Mentally speaking, his friend had been dead for a long time. A deep sadness suddenly overcame him. How was it possible that he, the great detective Sherlock Holmes, had been sleeping and living in the same room as Watson for days and hadn't even noticed? But blast it all, Dr. Watson had recognised him after all. Holmes carefully stretched out his hand towards him, wanting to touch him, to feel him. But instead of the hoped-for, joyful response, Watson's eyes closed at that very moment. He stretched in the bed. Holmes sensed how Watson fought against it, but lost the battle. Watson drifted away again and fell into an uneasy, restless sleep. Holmes stood by Watson's bed for a long while, observing his friend closely, until finally, overcome by fatigue, he returned to his own bed. However, he found no more sleep that night. "Good morning," came the chirpy voice from the neighbouring bed. Jonathan had just woken up. He eyed Holmes critically. "You look as though you haven't had a wink of sleep all night." "Very well observed," Holmes noted dryly. "Perhaps you should give Tony's tea a try after all. Since I've been drinking it, I sleep like a log." "Tell me." Holmes changed the subject. "Do you know the man opposite me?" "You mean the doctor?" "Why, yes, of course, poor chap." "What do you mean by that, Jonathan?" "As far as I know, this is already the third facility of this kind that the doctor has moved to. Apparently, he suffers from severe dementia and has had to endure many tragic blows in his life." How true, Holmes thought to himself. But when he arrived here, he was noticeably better. I could have quite decent conversations with him during his lucid moments. He told me about his murdered wife, the second one, as you must know. Holmes knew this all too well. But when he sank back into his grief, those moments of clarity were over. He eventually started resisting Violet too. If you ask me, That's when he began going downhill. They increased his medication dosage, and since then, he's been sleeping all day or just mumbling nonsense. Yet I'm convinced the doctor once possessed a razor-sharp mind. Holmes swallowed hard. Is there anything else you can tell me about him? Why are you so interested in the doctor? But well, you're quite an odd fellow anyway. He talked a great deal about his friend, with whom he solved the most intricate cases. Holmes's heart grew heavy. He could not remember when he had last cried, yet now he felt the urge to do so. If you want my opinion, I'm quite certain it was all just made up and lies. Probably, Holmes stammered. It was shortly after noon when the door flew open and a wheelchair, pushed by Alice, came in. "Hello, Grandpa Monty. I'm ready," Alice chirped cheerfully. Hesitantly, Holmes rose from his bed and planted his walking stick firmly on the floor. He greeted Alice coldly and sat down in the wheelchair. "I'm ready. We can go." Alice didn't need to be asked twice, and they left the institution directly. Once outside, Holmes drew the fresh air deep into his lungs. "So as I previously assumed, Mr. Jack Jordan's body is still in the pathology department?" Alice nodded. "And I trust you've already arranged an appointment for this afternoon?" Alice nodded again. "Has the cat got your tongue, or why are you only nodding today?" Holmes snapped at Alice irritably. Alice put her fists on her hips and replied just as emotionally, "You know perfectly well that you can rely on me. What I'd really like to know is what's got your knickers in a twist today." "More like a bed bug," Holmes muttered quietly, furtively scratching his bottom. "Very well, let us depart. We have no time for these hostilities, and your impertinent curiosity anyway." Alice's jaw dropped for a moment. Sherlock Holmes, that stubborn old man with all his peculiarities. The short distance to the forensics department could be covered perfectly well on foot, and Holmes quietly savoured his temporary escape from the nursing home. "I don't suppose you happen to remember the name of the pathologist performing the post-mortem?" Holmes needled. "The pathologist performing the autopsy in this case is Dr. Franklin Borowicz, and we have an appointment with that very person in precisely 7 minutes. Holmes nodded approvingly. Alice groaned loudly. "Now you're the one who's nodding." A few minutes later, Holmes and Alice arrived at the forensic department. At reception, they stated their names and their scheduled appointment with Mr. Borowicz. Shortly after, they were collected by a young yet unremarkable student and led into a large hall. On the black examination table lay a covered corpse. "Probably Mr. Jordan's," Holmes thought to himself, having to exercise considerable restraint not to peek straight under the sheet. But Holmes and Alice didn't have to wait long. An extremely likeable man in his mid-30s entered the room and immediately extended his right hand in greeting. "Mr. Holmes, it is an extraordinary honour to be of service to you. You are an authority and a living legend." Dr. Borowicz shook Holmes's hand effusively and seemed reluctant to let it go. "I've already had the pleasure of chatting with Mrs. Miller. I've also taken the liberty of preparing the body you're interested in." "That is exceedingly kind of you, Dr. Borowicz. Thank you for your consideration," Holmes flattered. "I trust you wouldn't mind if we proceed straight away." "Not in the slightest," said the doctor. At once, he went to the corpse and removed the covering cloth. Alice kept discreetly to the background. Never before had she been in a mortuary, let alone witnessed an autopsy, and she fervently hoped she would never have to repeat this experience. Old Mr. Jordan lay naked on the black table, stripped of all dignity. His wrinkled skin had already taken on a greyish hue and, to be honest, the emerging stench of decay was nearly unbearable. Furtively, Alice held her handkerchief over her nose and tried her best to breathe through her mouth. At the same time, she could hardly take her eyes off Mr. Jordan. "Nothing matters any more," she thought. "Regardless of whether you're old or young, whether you were rich or poor, evil or good, when you lie on this table, you're nothing more than a piece of rotting flesh." "Alice, are you all right? Can we begin?" Holmes pulled her from her thoughts. Slightly confused, she replied, "But of course, please do begin." Dr. Borowicz's attention returned to Holmes. "As you can see, despite refrigeration, The decomposition process has already begun slightly. Externally, there are virtually no visible marks. However, please pay close attention to the corpse's chest cavity. It has been compressed, with 3 ribs broken. External force was definitely involved, as we can absolutely rule out a fall, particularly since the body was found in bed. Dr. Borowicz paused briefly to let his visitors digest what they had heard. Next, I naturally examined his lungs. The likely scenario in this case would be that one of the broken ribs had pierced his lung, and that this was ultimately the cause of death. Which was not the case here, Holmes stated. "How do you know that?" asked Dr. Borowicz incredulously. "His rib cage was crushed and the ribs broken post-mortem. It takes quite a bit of force to break 3 ribs. However, I cannot detect any bruising or major pressure marks on the deceased's body, which means Mr. Jordan was already dead." Holmes braced his cane against the ground and rose from his wheelchair. Then he circled the corpse very slowly, as if this way he couldn't miss even the tiniest detail. He stopped at hip level, pulled a pencil from his trouser pocket, and used it to point at Mr. Jordan's thigh. "Did you notice this puncture mark here?" he asked Dr. Borowicz. "Of course, but since the old man comes from a nursing home and would have been given medication and injections, it's not worth any further investigation." Holmes muttered something incomprehensible under his breath and was already turning to leave. But then he stopped once again. "I presume you haven't found any other peculiarities on the body?" "No, I haven't." "Just as I thought," he muttered. "Mr. Borowicz, thank you for taking the time. You've been most helpful. Alice, if you please, we're leaving." Holmes couldn't seem to leave the building quickly enough. "And now?" asked Alice, completely baffled. "Have you solved the case?" "Yes, I have. Please get me home as quickly as possible. I'll explain everything else to you later." "What about your things at the retirement home?" she asked. "I'm donating them," Holmes replied curtly. Alice knew Holmes well enough to know that any further discussion would be pointless. She would have to be content with whatever Holmes was willing to reveal, and when. Holmes paced impatiently around his living room, circling his favourite armchair for what felt like the 500th time. Having barely arrived home, Holmes instructed Eddy, Alice's husband, to deliver a telegram from him to Inspector Wolfford and Inspector Lestrade. Alice and Eddy sat on the wide sofa in Holmes's sitting room and watched in disbelief as he nervously paced back and forth across the room. But gradually, Alice had had quite enough. "Mr. Holmes, if you don't stop this fidgety pacing about this instant and tell me straight away who is responsible for the murder in the retirement home, I swear to God, I'll take you straight back there and have you declared mentally incompetent." The knock at the door saved Holmes from Alice's outburst. "Come in, do come in," he called. Alice and Eddy turned eagerly towards the door. On the left and right stood Inspector Lestrade and Inspector Wolfford, supporting someone between them. No, could it be possible? Alice rubbed her eyes in disbelief. Dr. Watson? Visibly nervous, Holmes approached the 3 men and helped the 2 inspectors to further support Dr. Watson. "Alice, Eddy, up you get! Gentlemen, let's lay him down on the sofa." They carefully manoeuvred Dr. Watson, who was more asleep than awake, onto the wide sofa. "Do you know what you're doing here?" Inspector Wolfford asked sceptically. "Of course," Holmes assured confidently. "Where is the accompanying nurse, Tony, whom you were supposed to ask to join you?" "We were told that said nurse Tony was given leave and rushed home, as his grandfather had passed away a few hours ago." Honest grief and deep sympathy for the likeable nurse briefly overcame Holmes. "Thank you, gentlemen, for bringing Dr. Watson. You may leave now." The 2 inspectors looked at each other, baffled. "I thought you had solved the case. Who killed Mr. Jordan, then?" Inspector Wolfford wanted to know. "There is no case that needed solving. I assure you, gentlemen, the mysterious incidents in Chiswick have now come to an end." But Inspector Wolfford wasn't going to be dismissed that easily. "Surely you're not suggesting that Dr. Watson was responsible?" Holmes burst out laughing. "Oh no, I assure you, Dr. Watson was certainly not capable of this. You can see for yourself what state he's in, both mentally and physically. Inspector Wolfford looked down sceptically at the sleeping Dr. Watson. "If you don't believe me, Inspector, you're welcome to start investigating yourself. But I have one more request. Swear to me that you'll summon a certain Violet, a nurse in Chiswick, and ensure she receives her just punishment. She's severely abusing the patients. Simply listen to a few witness statements about this." Inspector Wolfford and Inspector Lestrade took their leave, although neither seemed entirely satisfied with the resolution of the case. When the Millers were finally alone with Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson, Alice couldn't hold back any longer. "Mr. Holmes, let's be frank now. Who is the murderer? And why didn't you reveal this to the two inspectors?" Holmes sat down on the sofa next to Dr. Watson, who was still peacefully dozing. "There were several potential perpetrators," Holmes began. "I discovered that an unknown man had made countless offers to Mrs. Ascot, the care home manager, to close the nursing facility so that he could build his residential units. However, no one could be considered a suspect who wasn't directly involved with the retirement home. That is, someone who neither works there nor is a patient. Therefore, this gentleman was ruled out as a perpetrator, even though he had an excellent motive. Mrs. Ascot herself would hardly damage her own facility. I could also exclude the patients, who would hardly find the opportunity to carry out such mischief in the middle of the night, quite apart from their physical and mental limitations. The main suspect was Nurse Violet, who would have been better suited working in a quarry than in a retirement home. While she may maintain an utterly despicable treatment of the patients, and although she can be accused of severe abuse, she hasn't directly killed anyone, nor is she responsible for the ghostly incidents." "Well, then who killed Mr. Jordan?" asked Alice impatiently. "Actually, it was an accident rather than an intentional murder. Tony, the nurse whom I wanted the inspectors to bring in, desperately wanted to prevent his beloved grandfather from being placed in this nursing home. He knows the poor conditions and is well aware of Violet's behaviour towards the patients. At heart, he's a genuinely good person who acted with the best of intentions. He thought that creating a bit of haunting would keep new patients away, forcing Mrs. Ascot to sell, and the existing patients would be distributed to other homes, including his grandfather. That's why he began his nighttime pranks. To avoid being identified as the culprit by patients with sleep disorders, he gave them a cup of tea laced with poppy juice at bedtime. My bed neighbour Jonathan was always quite keen on Tony's special tea. The deceased Jack Jordan also suffered from nighttime sleep disorders, and he too received Tony's tea. Unfortunately, on the night he died, he also received a high dose via injection from Violet, who used this measure far too often, as I had to experience personally. The injection site on Mr. Jordan's thigh proves this theory. The high overdose caused respiratory paralysis in Mr. Jordan. Tony noticed this and began desperate chest compressions, which sadly proved unsuccessful and only resulted in broken ribs. Alice and Eddy looked at each other in astonishment. "And what will happen to Dr. Watson?" Alice finally asked. Holmes looked down at his friend again. "I am now certain that Watson is not suffering from any severe form of dementia. After Caroline's death, that was his second wife, he fell into a prolonged state of shock. I can only explain it as the trauma causing Watson's mind to completely shut down to heal in peace. What is certain is that it was Watson who sent me the telegram. Alice, you remember the signature of the companion? No one but Watson could have been responsible, and my bed neighbour Jonathan also told me about a Dr. Watson who seemed to be of sound mind, but soon after that, Watson must have become too rebellious for our familiar Violet. Since then, Watson has been constantly under the influence of drugs. Only on the night when Violet was off duty and didn't administer an injection did he come to his senses for a brief moment. I am confident that once all the poison has left his body and our dear Watson has overcome the withdrawal that awaits him, only the normal age-related ailments will remain." Alice smiled happily and patted Holmes's hand sympathetically. "Mr. Holmes, if you don't mind me saying so, you seem as though you're finally whole again, and no longer half a person." It's not really in my nature to express my feelings, but you are absolutely right. However, I have quite a lot to make up for. For me, Watson was dead, and it nearly broke my heart. Meanwhile, I should never have turned away and abandoned him. Then none of this would have happened. "What does that mean now?" asked Alice cautiously. "That means, welcome home, Watson." Holmes stroked the sleeping Watson's arm affectionately. Shaking his head in disbelief, he said quietly, "Those thought dead live longer." You were listening to Charles Fraser, The Presumed Dead. The Adventures of the Elderly Sherlock Holmes. Episode 5. Based on the characters of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. A Go audio production.